So welcome to another Dumb Things People Say to Atheists, the series where we take a look at all those dumb things people just won't stop telling you. If you're an atheist, which I guess is a demographic this channel draws heavily from, and discuss why they're dumb, what makes often reasonable and decent people say them, and how you might constructively respond. Because even though this is some seriously low-hanging fruit, a lot of it is emotionally charged and hard to untangle in the moment, especially with people you know well, which makes it worth having a conversation about. Anyway, this week's dumb thing is rooted in one of the many false equivalencies that are promoted by apologists and accepted by their audiences. Compared to other dumb things people say to atheists, you aren't as likely to hear this one verbatim from friends or family members. The exact words are mostly spoken by public figures, including one especially fine fellow who's always happy to ham it up for Jesus but whose name currently eludes me. But the idea behind it has seeped through the evangelical community like a mind-rotting poison, turning Christians against anybody who believes anything else, and even against some forms of basic benign knowledge, in a way that may take generations for the movement to fully recover from. It affected my thinking into my waning years as a Christian, and even my earliest stages of atheism. And that is, stop pushing your atheistic worldview. What does that even mean? So to start with, we have to acknowledge that people can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different degrees when they talk about atheism being pushed on people. So pinning down what we're really talking about can be tricky and varies person to person. On the most blatantly ill-informed level is the obviously hysterical nonsense about how kids aren't allowed to pray or have Bibles at school and stuff like that, which really doesn't warrant any response beyond factual correction. A lot of people have this weird idea that public schools and universities are flatly anti-Christian and forbid any Christian practices just because they're Christian, probably as a setup for other mild persecution and indoctrination, I guess, when the reality is much more mundane. That teachers aren't allowed, in their official capacity, to lead prayer or engage in religious instruction of any kind. And this isn't to target any specific religion, but to protect students of non-religious or even other religious backgrounds from indoctrination by a public employee. This really benefits Christians as much as anybody else, protecting them not only from the theoretical Muslim or Buddhist teacher they're unlikely to encounter, but from Christians of any other denomination. Because if Christians gave basic consideration to the consequences of what they're asking for, the problem of having their kid receiving religious instruction from a Catholic, a Pentecostal, a King James Onlyist, or whatever they happen to find problematically different from their own theology, it seems they'd recognize that leaving schools religiously neutral benefits them as much as anybody else. But here's the problematic question. Are secular public schools really neutral? As far as that goes, can they be truly neutral? Now before you all shout yes at me, and it does turn out more or less being the answer by the way, please indulge me as I flesh out the second, slightly more thoughtful layer to this issue. Once you sift out rumors of schools stopping students from praying and God's not dead style professors making everyone proclaim atheism, you're still left with some slightly more nuanced, if ultimately misguided, problems that people see with institutionalized secularism such as public education. Basically, many people, and this used to include me, perceive certain dilemmas arising when any legal or moral or educational system runs up against the basic assumptions of its participants. It's summed up in a comment to my God's Not Dead critique, which said, "To a true believer, not being able to write a paper stating God created the universe in 6 days for a cosmology class is precisely the same as having to deny God's existence in order to pass the class." And this really hits at the core issue for a lot of people. At first glance, it appears that curricula that is supposed to be generally neutral will still be grounded in foundational values that carry their own baggage and, according to many fundamentalists, are as dogmatic, closed-minded, and fundamentalist as any religious belief. So when a teacher tells a student, "No, you're wrong for saying God created the universe in 6 days," they're opposing the convictions of the student and possibly the instruction of the student's parents as directly as a professor who makes them say God is dead. This feels especially true once apologists convince you that there's a legitimate debate over evolution and the origins of the universe. But even once you drop that nonsense and realize, there's obviously not, it still on some level can feel problematic that a Christian parent would have to send a child to a school in which they're told things, even if based on current prevailing science, that directly contradict the convictions and religious instruction of their family. At some point, anything that any institution teaches will end up at direct odds with someone's personal convictions or religious beliefs. So should we expect a family to concede to a current scientific consensus, one that could be wrong and might be overturned in the future, that contradicts their deeply held convictions, and not only that, but send their child off to receive daily instruction to that effect? And this is only the tip of the iceberg, especially in the educational sphere, which is what I find myself focusing on because that's a lot of where Christians focus and where this gets most sticky. If opening up a class with prayer condones a specific religion, doesn't not opening a class with prayer, at least for some students, come off as an implied statement that prayer is not important, as well as possibly an endorsement of secularism? After all, if praying looks like something a Christian teacher does, doesn't not praying look like something an atheist teacher, or at least a teacher who doesn't find prayer important, would do? And doesn't the lack of a prayer then send a signal to the student that the teacher comes from a different belief set with a different set of values, making the environment feel less friendly to Christian students? Or if a teacher displaying a cross is an implicit yet problematic endorsement of Christianity, isn't it just as problematic if a teacher puts up a safe space sign that endorses acceptance of the LGBTQ community, and by implication opposes Christian teaching on the issue? At one point in my life, these problems had me wondering if public education was even tenable, or whether, instead, a voucher system was needed to ensure that all parents could send their kids to a school where their own basic values were at the foundation of the instruction, or at least where other people's contradictory values were not, and they come closest to lending the appearance of credibility to statements that in schools and elsewhere, atheists are pushing their worldview. If you pick a natural cosmos over a created one, or any of the many creationist caricatures of this dilemma, and you know what they sound like, or if you choose no prayer over prayer, or if you allow schools to be peppered with safe space signs but not crosses, you're picking sides on issues that must necessarily be based on atheistic assumptions or Christian ones. Now yes, I am an atheist, and this is dumb things people say to atheists. So please be patient because I'm really trying to steelman the out of this issue, which is kind of necessary for us to really understand it and to really understand Christians' concerns. This is often posed in terms of a suggestion by apologists that everything that's taught, whether it's traditional family values or any other issue, must fall on one side or the other of a faith-based assumption of where the universe came from. Do you think, for example, that marriage must be between one man and one woman and the woman must submit to the man in accordance with God's word? That's ultimately rooted in belief that God created the universe, right? But do you think everybody in society shouldn't be held to this standard? Well, that must just as certainly be rooted in an equally faith-based belief that the universe randomly came from the Big Bang and we all evolved. So if you teach secular or any non-Christian values to students, you're pushing an atheistic worldview. You're willfully selecting from one side of a false dilemma set up by apologists instead of being open-minded and allowing for both sets of values to be taught. But two things about this. One, this isn't an issue of both sides, because there are a multitude of guest-based religious assumptions people could bring to the table. And two, we don't need faith in the Big Bang or any other atheistic assumptions to create a sensible set of secular rules for society to live by. I mean, does it not make sense to look at the world as we see it, try to understand which actions harm others or disrupt society and which are benign, and create rules that help us live better together? And can we not do this without making any assumptions about where the universe came from? And really, what do those assumptions have to do with it anyway? Yet somehow apologists have successfully undermined the conversation by suggesting that not importing Christian assumptions into this reasonable conversation is the same as importing atheistic Big Bang cosmology assumptions into the conversation. It's simply not, and we don't need to let the conversation be held hostage by this nonsense or its implications. I mean, imagine a ship was sailing in the middle of a storm. It's very important for the crew to understand a lot of things about wind, weather, waves, how to set sails and repair leaks, and so on. I'm clearly not a sailor, but I read a couple Master and Commander books, so trust me. So it's absolutely vital that the seafaring community apply and reinforce this knowledge, along with passing it on to future generations of sailors, right? But what if a few people on the ship believe very strongly that Aeolus sent the winds and Poseidon controlled the waves and magical monsters roam the seas, and it was urgent that the crew make sacrifices to the gods and avoid locations the monsters were believed to be? The captain naturally thinks, "F that. I have a ship to run and a crew to save and a storm to get through," and he ignores the religious suggestions. What did this captain do? Did he make an atheistic assumption that gods and monsters do not exist? Did he presume to understand a naturalistic cosmology about the entire universe? Or did he merely recognize that, within the realm he can observe and interact with, the weather and seas behave certain ways and certain actions are demonstrated to help safely navigate them, while sacrifices and avoiding sea monsters are mere guesses that, well, okay, fine, he'll respect people's belief in them, are not proven and don't lead to actions that have demonstrated benefits for safely maneuvering a ship. So his responsibility as a captain is to apply and, when necessary, educate others in behaviors known to have a positive effect on the situation. And his failure to apply mystical solutions based on guesses is not the same as contradicting those guesses. It's just putting them in their proper place until they're proven the way we expect all other ideas to be proven. This analogy applies very neatly to what we need to do as a society and the place religion is trying to demand in the conversation. We should be holding an ongoing conversation based on what we observe in the world around us about what useful information we teach and apply, as well as how we behave toward others and what we do and don't tolerate. The demand that we bring unproven religious assumptions into this conversation is as absurd as demanding that a ship's captain set his course and center his efforts on pleasing gods and avoiding monsters. And the insinuation that educating our children and running our society based on what we can reliably verify and show to be useful is somehow pushing an atheistic worldview based on a godless cosmology is as absurd as claiming that the captain is pushing an atheistic worldview based on godless cosmology. Now, does intelligently reacting to the universe as we see it look just a little like atheism? Maybe. But, maybe that should tell us something, and something other than reacting intelligently to the universe is pushing an atheistic worldview. The fact is that, broadly speaking, what happens in public schools, and other aspects of secular society, though my focus has admittedly become narrow for this video, is not pushing an atheistic worldview, and it does not need to be a problem for Christians. If they can properly converse with their children about what participating in a pluralistic society looks like, explaining that they can maintain their understanding of how important prayer is, while still understanding why a public institution with children of different religions and even different Christian denominations shouldn't lead or endorse prayers, then the absence of corporate prayer in the classroom will not come off as weird, threatening, or even out of place. The child can understand that the teacher, by not leading prayer, is not acting in opposition to their worldview and might even be a devout Christian. In other words, if the lack of prayer has this weird power to come off as an anti-Christian gesture, Christian parents can rob the act of this power by explaining what it really means. In fact, by misrepresenting what a lack of prayer in school means, Christians are actually, ironically, giving the act this power. The same can go for any other form of secular instruction. If schools openly endorse tolerance of homosexuals, which they very well should, even fundamentalist, anti-LGBTQ Christian parents can use the opportunity to explain that not everybody shares their values, and that in the absence of any religious doctrine, people are left to try to figure out which actions harm others and disrupt society, while living at peace with others whose lifestyles, while possibly different, are not clearly harmful. So when schools accept LGBTQ students and teach acceptance of them, they're not opposing Christianity. They're just acting on the same principle of allowing whatever does no harm that everybody, including fundamentalists, until it runs into one of their pet issues, acts on when deciding how to live together in a cohesive society. Now, yeah, there's a bit of nuance that arises with the question, what if someone put up a safe space sign with a cross to show acceptance of Christian students? But what each sign communicates is vastly different in light of the power dynamic within our society and what each community is pushing for in public discourse, and I don't have time to belabor the point for people who wish not to understand why. But if Christians will stop trying to make these false equivalencies, give any thought into why the general public and educational institutions tolerates people their religion doesn't, and pass this understanding on to their children, then basic skills of getting along with other people won't feel like a threat to their core values. And finally, perhaps most obviously, parents can explain that, if schools teach prevailing science that differs from their specific religion's doctrine, it just means that's the best information we currently have based on the evidence. Even if you believe dipshit nonsense about how creationists have proof against evolution, you can let your child learn about the current prevailing theory in school, then instruct them otherwise in your own time. After all, if the proof against evolution is as strong as you think it is, nothing they are taught at school should be a threat, right? And it should all come crumbling down the first time they watch AIG materials, right? But I suspect deep down you know that's not the case. But then, what if people believe there isn't a clear consensus on evolution? Well, anybody who thinks that is wrong in such an obvious way that they're choosing to be wrong. All this is to say that Christians can, like everybody else in the world, including me, send their children to institutions that teach some things they disagree with without considering it a crisis. They can discuss why these disagreements arise in a pluralistic society and why a secular, meaning inclusive not atheist, instruction has to be limited to that for which we have clear evidence. And if this doesn't include what you believe on faith or at some point contradicts what you believe on faith, that's just because our best attempts at distilling our current body of knowledge into an education for our children won't line up perfectly with everybody's personal opinions, much less their specific fundamentalist religious doctrine. You can prepare your child to cope with this fact while still maintaining their faith, and in the process teach them their first life lessons and the skill of holding deep personal beliefs while still respecting and interacting cooperatively with those who don't share those beliefs. But when you set the stage for your children to see anything contrary to or even not directly associated with your religion as part of an atheistic worldview, then you're creating an unnecessary crisis in their minds. You're setting them up to feel like their faith is being undermined by things that don't need to undermine it. You're instilling in them a distorted sense that everybody in the world goes around obsessing over your personal religion, and thus that those who teach anything contrary to it are doing so out of willful opposition to it and are somehow out to attack them in their beliefs. And not only are you subjecting them to the distress of being in the middle of a battle invented by you and the apologists you listen to, but in the long run, you're training them to imagine that in any interaction with anybody, they need to stake out all the territory for their own fundamentalist teachings, then feel like this territory is being attacked by anybody who holds any other form of belief. Then they end up entrenched against the world, failing to cooperate with anybody who disagrees with them, and feeling that they're being persecuted whenever they don't hold ultimate dominionist control over everything. But then maybe that's the goal of this invented idea that everybody's pushing an atheistic worldview. This program was made possible by a grant from S.R. Foxley, Bob Generic, Brandon Lemire, Bullwinkle, and Q, and by the generous support of viewers like you. If you'd like to join them in pledging to this channel, please find a link to the Prophet of Zod Patreon below.